welcome. My name is Lyse Doucet. I'm a BBC journalist, I'm a Canadian, and I'm a member of the Frontline Club, as many of you are here. Now, I know in the Frontline Club, we like to very much focus on the present and try to predict the future or to care about the future. But just for a nanosecond, let me be just a little bit nostalgic. Because once upon a time, not so far away and not so long ago, there was a world in which there was, alas, no Frontline Club. But there was the beginning of what became Frontline News. And where did it begin? Well, a group of very courageous, committed, and talented, all good-looking ex-British officers settled at Canal Bank Road in Peshawar in northwest Pakistan. They were the first to go into Afghanistan to try to report this story during the Mujahideen war against the Soviets. That was in the northwest of Pakistan. In the east of Pakistan, there was a mad, compassionate, brilliant, committed journalist, and his name was Ahmed Rashid. Now, he was covering Afghanistan even before the Frontline boys arrived, and they include, I have to say, Vaughn Smith, in case he's watching this on the internet. He was in Afghanistan when Soviet troops invaded in 1979. He was a frequent visitor to the country in the years of the war, and he's been a frequent visitor ever since. In fact, I like to say that Ahmed Rashid may be the virus for that very infectious disease known as Afghanitis. Now, the Afghan government may have a big problem getting rid of heroin addicts, but it's nothing compared to the problem of getting rid of Afghan addicts. The Afghan government and Afghanistan and that region is stuck with them. And if you're interested in that region, this book is not going to cure you. But it is a critical book and a book worth reading. And why? Because many of you perhaps have come here tonight asking the question, what went wrong? 2001, late 2001, so many leaders stood shoulder to shoulder and said, we will be with Afghanistan for the long run. And so many Afghans dared to hope that this time, after a quarter century and more of war, they would get it right. But what are the headlines now and what is the discussion? They're all about a Taliban insurgency. They're about a new stronghold for al-Qaeda based in the tribal areas of Pakistan. There's concern about the capacity and the corruption of the Afghan government, and questions too about the future of democracy across the region, including Pakistan and Central Asia. Ahmed Rashid's newest book, Descent into Chaos, takes us through those critical years, but it also looks to the future. And tonight, we're very grateful to have Ahmed Rashid here with us, and we'd like to have a conversation that involves everyone, because I see in the audience a lot of you who have spent many years working in the region, worrying about the region. We're going to begin with the privilege of the evening that I'm going to ask some of the questions to Ahmed, and then we'd like to open it up. I think a lot of the initial focus will be on the relationships inside Afghanistan, Afghanistan with the West and with Pakistan. But of course, Ahmed spreads his book quite widely, and we can also talk about Central Asia as well, if you have questions. But please join me in welcoming journalist and fellow traveler Ahmed Rashid.
Thank you. Can I say a few words? Can I just say a few words? If I can just say a few words. I mean, thank you so much for all of you for coming. But I just want to thank a few people. Martin Woolacott is here, who published my first article in the British press in 1978, when he was foreign editor. And I turned up completely out of the blue, and he eventually took my article. Michael Fathers, who was my editor at The Independent, the funniest editor ever on Fleet Street, and he remains the funniest. He's a bit deaf now, but he's still very funny. I wanted to thank my sister, my niece, Sultana, my niece. I'm very proud to say my niece, Michelle, is now also a very prominent figure and a star. Thank you to the BBC for coming. Victoria, thank you very much for coming, a very old friend of Pakistan. And Ziauddin from Dawn, and other friends from Pakistan who are here. It's wonderful to see you.
Ahmed, let's go back to late 2001. The Taliban had collapsed. You were part of a group of Afghan experts, as they were known then, that was brought together by the United Nations to figure out how to move next in Afghanistan. At that point, did you believe that actually that the West working with Afghanistan, working with the region would get it right? This was a real chance?
I believed it simply because I arrived in New York a few weeks after 9/11, and I saw the site, and I saw the kind of trauma that the Americans had been through, and I just could not believe that George Bush would, in fact, not take Afghanistan seriously, and that meant, of course, helping form a government and helping reconstruct the country. And I mean, what my book outlines is that literally within weeks of routing the Taliban in Afghanistan and pushing them out, the Americans were already focused on Iraq. And one of the very big reasons why Rumsfeld did not put troops down in Afghanistan, just remember, I mean, there were 800 troops that basically were on the ground in December of 2001. And 3 months later, I think there were a total of about 2,500. That was it for a country the size of Iraq almost, with a similar kind of population. And we just couldn't believe it, and I mean, but nobody could quite believe. I mean, we thought, the Americans, well, they don't know what to do. They have no game plan, they have no expertise, etc. And nobody could quite believe that, in fact, for the next 3.5 years, as I write about, there was going to be nothing in Afghanistan. The warlords were going to be empowered. Reconstruction was not going to take place. The troops were not going to be there to stabilize the situation. And so, really, I mean, I'm very blunt, and I say that Afghanistan, despite the words of Tony Blair and George Bush, Afghanistan was abandoned again for 3.5 years.
Okay, you mentioned a number of critical areas there. Let's start with the troops. It was said, despite Afghans' reputation of not liking invaders, that time and time again it says that Afghans wanted the foreign troops there. They didn't come in the numbers or sent to the right places. How critical was that? What should have been done at the very start?
Well, I think, again, I mean, the West completely misjudged Afghan sentiment, because Afghan sentiment back then was, I think 90% of the population basically wanted the foreign troops, not for the sake of foreign troops, but because they saw the foreign troops as bringing in the money and the resources to reconstruct the country. And they knew that they had to, have, and secondly, they didn't want the warlords back. And they saw the foreign troops as being security against the warlords, and of course the remnants of the Taliban. And of course exactly the opposite happens. The money and resources don't come in adequately, and the foreign troops don't come in to protect them from the warlords. Instead, exactly the opposite happens. The warlords are empowered.
So in fact, if they had put larger numbers of troops outside in the areas along the border with Pakistan, instead of concentrating a small number in Kabul with the International Security Assistance Force, and the Americans concentrating very much on finding the remnants of Al-Qaeda, that would have made a difference? Well,
if you remember, Lyse, this was a huge debate going on throughout 2002 and 3. First of all, the US administration had rebuffed NATO. NATO wanted to take part in the attack on Afghanistan. Rumsfeld told NATO, thank you very much, but we don't need you. And subsequently after that, when the first British contingent and the ISAF force was made to secure Kabul, there was willingness, and I outlined that there was willingness amongst the Europeans to spread out from Kabul and to send more European troops as peacekeepers. And at that time, the Taliban had been routed. They would have been genuine peacekeepers. And the Americans refused to accept any non-American troops outside Kabul, because they said this will interfere with our operations against Al-Qaeda. What really was that they did not want anyone bogged down in Afghanistan or committed to Afghanistan, because they were going to do Iraq. And Iraq, they hoped to get these same European troops to come and enlist in Iraq. They didn't want to spread the load as far as occupying both Afghanistan and Iraq was concerned.
You have no doubt that the decision to go to Iraq was a fatal blow to the Afghan mission.
Absolutely. I mean, for example, I mean, even today, a lot of people talk about, the very ineffectual and weak government in Kabul. Well, that's fine. But then if you look at the history of the last 7 years, I mean, you have to give some credit to the fact that, the President Karzai or whoever you like, they were very badly let down. They were very badly let down by the international community. For 3.5 years, the reconstruction really didn't start. The whole of 2002, Karzai goes to Washington, begs Bush to build one road in Afghanistan, which was the Kabul-Kandahar highway. It took 4 meetings with Bush to convince him that this road was needed. And so reconstruction doesn't start, the stability is not there, and so the deals that the Afghan government is then forced to cut with the warlords and with very unsavory characters. Now, you couldn't really blame them because, I mean, the Americans were not taking Afghanistan seriously, unfortunately.
As you describe Rumsfeld's greatest, most fatal mistake as being his policy of working with the warlords.
Absolutely, because that also left the Afghan government with very little choice. If the Americans, in fact, I mean, if the foreign forces were not going to support the president of Afghanistan in administering his country through a proper governmental system, which had to be, which had to take root and be installed and all the rest of it. But instead, the Americans wanted to rule the country through the warlords. What was the president of Afghanistan supposed to do? He didn't have a military force under him. He wasn't a warlord himself, so that he had a militia. So I think, that was, I think, the biggest mistake. And that, of course, that encouraged the neighbors also. When Pakistan, when Iran, when Central Asia, when they saw all this happening, they said, well, the Americans are going to walk out of here in the next 1 or 2 years. We better get our proxies ready. In other words, we better repeat what we did in the 1990s, which was interfere in Afghanistan and and back one warlord against another.
But President Karzai himself didn't really want to get rid of the warlords. I mean, he had contradictory views on this. He had this big tent idea of bringing everyone in, that he could convince them to adopt new policies. And even you describe Ismail Khan, the warlord in the West, as a genuine warlord. They control territory, they have a certain amount of support, and the Americans said, let's work with them.
There, certainly in the beginning, I mean, he was completely powerless, and he did work with the warlords. But there came a time just before the invasion of Iraq when actually he wanted to start getting rid of them. In particular, Ismail Khan, who had been creating a lot of mayhem in Herat, and the Americans, don't back him. The Americans say, don't bother us now. I mean, because getting rid of one warlord may create insecurity. We can't commit any troops. I mean, we don't want to get bogged down in a controversial issue in Afghanistan. We're about to do Iraq. And they actually reject any initiative by the government to get rid of Ismail Khan.
But of course, it was, and there's some people who were working with the United Nations in Afghanistan, stability was the overriding objective. Don't rock the boat. Don't take on the warlords. Because right now in Afghanistan, stability is the most important thing.
Well, I think the UN also realized very early on, perhaps earlier than us journalists did, that, there was a double game going on here, that, Afghanistan was not the target for rebuilding and reconstruction, that in fact Iraq was the target. And now the UN could not jump ahead of the Americans. I mean, the UN did not have the kind of resources to try and interfere and to do more than it possibly could. It had to do what was within its capacity and with what the international community was aiming to do. If the Americans were going to limit the international role in Afghanistan because of Iraq, the UN was forced to do the same.
But there's no doubting the enormous amount of goodwill for Afghanistan, and billions were pledged at aid conferences. So why didn't it translate into tangible improvements for Afghans on the ground? So many say now, my life hasn't changed.
Well, I mean, there's a long story about aid in this book about reconstruction, but I mean, very simply, I think the basic problem on reconstruction simply was that there was no rebuilding of the infrastructure of the country. The aim should have been to rebuild the infrastructure and kickstart the economy, and get Afghans to start trading and start working, and which would provide jobs. It's some investment in agriculture, so you would have avoided the whole poppy boom. And the infrastructure, I mean, is appalling today, if you see. I mean, 6% of Afghans today have electricity. This is 8 years on. Kabul gets electricity every other night for 4 hours. There's no electricity during the day. So who's going to put up a factory or a workshop? How can students study? How can people do their ordinary work when this is the situation? I mean, nobody in 8 years has put up a power station in Afghanistan. I mean, it defeats all logic as to, and yes, I mean, good things have been done. There's been investment in education, 6 million children have gone to school. There's been investment in health. Women's health has improved enormously. Women are now in the workforce for the first time as teachers and doctors and nurses. So, I mean, you know, things have happened. But I think most recently, if you see the report by BARG, you know, the British Committee on Afghanistan, and by Oxfam, I mean, they're saying that something like 30 or 40% of American aid is wasted. It either goes back to America as fees for contractors, or it is literally wasted because of overpricing of projects that is being done, you know, by these contractors. Now, if again, I mean, this was exactly what happened in Iraq. I mean, the same mistakes that that the international community committed in Afghanistan were repeated in Iraq. If after 8 years you still haven't got this right, I mean, something is really drastically wrong, I think.
Well, you had Ashraf Ghani, the former finance minister, basically saying that this is an indictment of the aid community. They actually didn't know what to do. All these different agencies came together with different priorities, different structures, but they didn't actually know how to rebuild the country after war. And even Lakhdar Brahimi has conceded that.
Yeah, I mean, I think absolutely. I mean, a lot of the countries, you know, wanted to put their own flag on their various projects. So, for example, there was a lot of duplication, and very, you know, which led to waste, you know, obviously. Now, this wasn't helped by the other factors inside Afghanistan, which was that, you know, drugs were booming, so there was massive corruption inside the government, and the aid money that did reach people, ordinary Afghans, was a lot of that was wasted by the Afghans themselves in corruption. And there has not been an effective mechanism within the government to deal with this. So, frankly, I mean, you know, it's been a very serious problem on both sides of the divide.
So then you paint this picture, and it's well known to many of you who've been traveling to the region, of a country where the aid effort isn't working, not in a way that Afghans feel it's making a difference, not enough troops in the right places, not enough good governance, growing insecurity. So on the other side of that is a growing Taliban insurgency, and the question about where they had gone after they were defeated. Well, they were toppled in 2001, but not defeated. And this is one of your most compelling chapters in the book about the Pakistan connection. Perhaps tell us a bit about the role that Pakistan played, as you saw it, in those critical years.
Well, I think one of the critical mistakes made by the Americans was that, you know, in order to conduct the war, they did forge a very effective regional alliance. So you had India and Pakistan together, you know, helping the Americans. The Americans were talking to Iran, if you remember. Yet within 6 weeks of the war ending, this whole alliance just broke up. You know, India and Pakistan went to war almost with each other. The Americans stopped talking to Iran and called Iran the great Satan, the axis of evil. And what happens is that basically all these neighboring countries who'd spent the whole of the last decade interfering in Afghanistan, arming one side or the other covertly, decides to do the same thing. What happened vis-a-vis Pakistan simply was that they took in the Taliban leadership. I mean, the Taliban leadership escaped into Pakistan, and the Pakistan military then basically allowed them to stay. Now, they were helped in this by the Americans, because the Americans told them, we're not interested in the Taliban. You can do what you like with the Taliban. Just catch us Al-Qaeda, get us Osama. That is the main thing. And people in the Afghan government were very early on telling the Americans, don't leave the Taliban in the hands of the Pakistan military and the intelligence community. Because if you do that, the whole thing is going to start again. And the Americans said, no, don't worry, the real threat is Al-Qaeda, it's not the Taliban. And I remember in February, the first mission came to Washington, February 2002. That's within 8 weeks. The first mission came from Afghanistan to Washington to tell Bush precisely this. And the administration was not listening. I think what happens after that simply is that the Taliban get sanctuary, they reorganize, they have, you know, almost 4 years until the Pakistan army goes into the tribal areas, which is in 2004. They have about 3 years with which to reorganize themselves. They get embedded in Al-Qaeda again. There's the growth of the Pakistani Taliban, who start out as these protectors and the providers of food and lodging and housing for Al-Qaeda and the Afghan Taliban. These Pakistani Taliban then then become militia leaders in their own right, and there's just a kind of huge growth. And in 2003, we have the start of the insurgency, and which of course now is enormous. And I've been writing for several years now, saying simply that as long as there is this sanctuary in Pakistan, in Balochistan province for the Afghan Taliban leadership, and in the Northwest Frontier province for the Taliban's allies and Al-Qaeda, you cannot deal with this civil war, with this insurgency. You can send as many troops and do as much as you like, but guerrilla wars are fought against a guerrilla force that you estimate has a finite number of people, a finite number of bullets to fire, and ammunition and guns and support and recruits. In this case, the Taliban have an infinite number of recruits, because they are based not in Afghanistan, they're based next door. And they can draw upon, for example, the Pashtun population in Pakistan, which is 10 times the number of Afghan Pashtuns. And of course, they're being joined now by many, many non-Pashtuns also. So I think this has become now, in my opinion right now, the biggest crisis that the international community faces, and of course Pakistan faces, is not the issue of Al-Qaeda, not the issue of the Pakistani Taliban even, until the army decides to strategically decides to withdraw its support from the Afghan Taliban and actually arrest them or capture them or hold them or whatever it is, and cut their ties with the commanders inside Afghanistan, we are not going to see any change in the military situation inside Afghanistan.
And yet in the years that you chart, in which President Musharraf was a key ally of the United States in the so-called War on Terror, you talk about how there were changes made at the leadership of the ISI. President Musharraf did make some efforts to work with the Americans. He did send tens of thousands of troops in an unprecedented move into the federally administered tribal areas. Why did that not? What kept it going?
Well, I think certainly for the first 3 years, the army didn't go into the tribal areas, and throughout this period, my main point was that the Afghan Taliban leadership is based in Balochistan province, where they kept very quiet. They were told not to bring Arabs down there or bring any foreigners down there, so that the Americans would not really focus on it. And they've been able to continue the war in the south by rearming the Taliban in the south very effectively without any interference from the international community. And that has obviously been of great benefit to them. Now, in the northwest, the Americans put much more pressure on the Pakistan military and the intelligence because of Al-Qaeda. Osama was believed to be in the northwest, the whole of Al-Qaeda's leadership, and Pakistan has delivered very considerable numbers of leading Al-Qaeda people. Recently not so much, but in the early years, all the, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and all the top Al-Qaeda leaders who had planned 9/11 or had tried to implement it were caught and were delivered to the Americans. So there was this dual strategy going on. I write, for example, the Americans are, realized this quite early on, and they're trying to discover, they spend a lot of time trying to discover, who is doing this dual strategy. Is it Musharraf? Is it the army? Is it the ISI? Is it a rogue ISI which is doing this without Musharraf's knowing? And essentially they could not come to a conclusion, because if they came to a conclusion that it was the state and it was the state that had ordered this strategy, and it was Musharraf who had ordered this strategy, Bush would have had to admit that his policy, that Musharraf was not an ally of the US, and that his own policy had been a failure, that in fact he'd been duped by the Pakistani military. And it was not something that he was prepared to admit to. So I think, whatever, secret conclusions the Americans came to, they could not come to the real conclusion. They had to come to, now of course they're very outspoken about this. The US Congress is, the CIA is, the State Department is, and even we've had Bush talking about now for the first time sanctuaries in Pakistan. So, but now the situation has become very, very desperate, I think.
Well, you write in your book about the Americans not wanting to move too strongly against Musharraf because they were afraid to rock the boat. They thought Musharraf was the man. If he was toppled, if someone else replaced him, it would be more difficult to find a partner, and they were worried about politics in Pakistan.
Yeah, I think that's very true. But also we should remember that the insurgency in Iraq had taken off, and the Americans were totally preoccupied with dealing with that insurgency. They didn't want to be bothered with Afghanistan and Pakistan at that moment.
But give us, put it in a broader context, because often when there are discussions about Pakistani alleged or otherwise Pakistani involvement in Afghanistan, the India dimension doesn't come to it. As you say in your book, it's not that the ISI officers, the senior military intelligence, don't understand the situation. It's part of a broader strategy, which is a regional one, and their worries about India, some of which, as you say in your book, are well-founded.
Well, what I try and describe is that the military has a rationale. Now, I may not accept it, and you may not accept it, but it does have a rationale for what it's doing, and it's linked to it's linked very heavily to the fear of India's presence in Kabul, India's presence in Afghanistan, destabilizing Pakistan. For example, there's the accusation by the military and the intelligence in Pakistan that India is helping the Baloch insurgency in Balochistan. Now, true or not, I mean, I think the one of the major problems has been because of this breakdown of leadership by the West in the region. Since Pakistan and India shook hands in 2004, but since then there's been absolutely no progress on the key issue of Kashmir. And to Musharraf's credit, I mean, he has, I think, genuinely taken the army, moved the army, shifted the army strategically from, wanting to take Kashmir by force, wanting to divide Kashmir, wanting to, I think there's been real progress in that Pakistan has dropped a lot of its demands on Kashmir and would really like a quick and easy solution, which would essentially be a kind of faith-saving solution for both countries. I don't think anybody now is demanding, the Muslims come here, the Hindus go there, or partitioning Kashmir or anything like that. But, the Indians needed to move forward on this, and they haven't. And in 4 years, there was really no diplomatic pressure on the Indians to do anything about this. And I think that has been one of the main rationales for the army to say that until the Indians move and until we feel more secure vis-a-vis India, we are going to back any force that is anti-Indian. And the Taliban proved themselves in the 90s as being very anti-Indian. They didn't even allow an Indian embassy to open in Kabul. You couldn't have been more anti-Indian as the Taliban were in the 1990s. So that was one of the rationales. I mean, I think there were other rationales, but Lyse, I think the main issue today is that this war today is not confined to Afghanistan. This is now becoming a regional war. And I think a lot of our policymakers refuse to recognize this and don't want to see this. The Taliban, there are now Pakistani Taliban. There are Central Asian Taliban. There are Sunni Taliban in Iran right now, also fighting the Shia regime in Iran. Now, you may call them different names, but essentially they are the spawn of this whole conflict in Afghanistan and what is happening in Pakistan and the laxity with which the army has treated them in Pakistan. Now, this whole region, the war is not being confined to Afghanistan, it's expanding outside Afghanistan. And there's really no strategy of the US or Britain or anyone else to understand this and deal with this. This cannot be resolved by military means. It doesn't mean you have to send hundreds of thousands of troops. It needs a major political, diplomatic, economic initiative, not with one country but with all these neighboring countries. Now that's something, I mean, the Americans, can't walk and chew gum at the same time. They can't handle two crises at the same time. What I describe is an even worse situation. You've got to handle, to do Afghanistan, you have to do Pakistan. To do Pakistan, you've got to do India. And then on the other side, you've got Iran and Central Asia. So you've got to handle like 6 countries at the same time if you want to really try and stabilize Afghanistan. Now, is the next US administration going to be capable of doing that? Are they, first of all, going to understand the problem rather than just see Afghanistan in this Afghanistan is boxed in with these 4 walls and all we have to do is to deliver the right amount of helicopters and troops and guns and we can resolve this problem. It can't be resolved so easily.
Well, and you mentioned, of course, the regional scope of this, and one of the key actors, of course, will be the Pakistan government. Your last chapter is about the tragic assassination of Benazir Bhutto, the consequences which flow from that, the Musharraf power waning in Pakistan. Where do you see now, you seem to see a more promising future with this new civilian government, although they haven't seemed to have found their feet when it comes to this sort of regional crisis?
Well, I'm hopeful on both counts. I mean, I'm hopeful on Afghanistan simply because I think the majority of Afghans do not want the Taliban back. I'm hopeful on Pakistan because of the results of these elections. I mean, not necessarily the performance of the government at the moment, which has been very weak, but the elections did two things. The people of Pakistan voted against the party of the army. They voted against the army and the party of the army. And then, secondly, they voted against the Islamic parties. And they voted in a secular party in the center, the People's Party of Benazir Bhutto, and they voted in, even perhaps more significantly, a secular party in the Northwest Frontier Province, a Pashtun party, which believes in non-violence, if you please. I mean, if anyone can believe that. But this is a party that goes back to the whole Gandhian philosophy of non-violence. It's a party that, you know, is almost pre-partition party. It hasn't been around for the last 30 years. The army doesn't like it. But, you know, so I mean, genuinely, you have, in my opinion, on paper at least, a coalition government in Islamabad, which does include all the major parties except Musharraf's party and the fundamentalists. Now, yes, it has not got its feet on the ground. Now, I think one reason for that is that, unfortunately, Musharraf has left a rubble in his footsteps, because the last year he imposed martial law, he you know, sacked the judiciary, he sacked everyone, the constitution was suspended, etc. And the government now has to kind of pick up this rubble and try and put this rubble together. And there are huge conflicts within the coalition government about how to put this rubble back together again, and whether, in fact, this rubble can become a building again. And not to speak of the fact that essentially the foreign policy remains very tightly controlled by the military. In a situation where the coalition government is struggling to try and get some common agreement amongst themselves on dealing with the judges' issues, with the constitution, etc., etc., the army is very reluctant to deal with the threat of the Pakistani Taliban. We saw, for example, in the handling of the Peshawar issue, this threat to Peshawar of the last... Now, Peshawar has been literally under siege for 3 months. The army didn't move in 3 months. Despite appeals by the provincial government, by you know, the media, everybody was pointing out that, you know, these Taliban were within 5 miles of Peshawar. The army didn't move, it finally moved, and then did not send in troops, but sent in the Frontier Corps. The Frontier Corps is very directly linked to the Taliban and has great sympathies with the Taliban. And what is happening in this great push, the Frontier Corps has not caught anyone, they haven't captured anyone. All has happened is that these militias have been pushed 10 miles outside the city.
So what is their game?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's a good question. I think more and more Pakistanis are asking. There's been, in the last 2 days, there's been a real uproar from even within the government. Government ministers are asking what the army is up to. So, unfortunately, you know, you have a situation where one side of the establishment in Pakistan is not playing with a straight bat at all. There's no transparency as to what they're doing. Baitullah Masood, the leader of the Pakistani Taliban, is giving press conferences. He can invite 40 journalists up there. You know, nobody is aiming to kill him or to capture him or to arrest him. He's able to get journalists to come from Islamabad and drive the whole length of the federal administered tribal areas and give a press conference. Now, what are Pakistanis to presume from this? What is the government to presume from this? You know, and yet we still have the Bush administration essentially saying, you know, that we want to support Musharraf. We are not necessarily, unfortunately, the support for Musharraf is probably more than it's been more often expressed than support for the coalition government has been expressed.
But what is the solution? Because when the new civilian leaders came to power, including members of the ANP, who have, as you say, they've had a reputation of not backing violence, they've had very good relations, ironically, with Karzai and with Afghanistan, they said, we want to talk to the militants. This will not be the appeasement of President Bashar, but we want to talk to them. Yet still, since this deal-making has been going on, the attacks have gone up by about 40 to 50%. So what's gone wrong? What is the answer to the problems in Fatah?
I think what, the ANP's concept of talking to the militants is completely different from the army's concept of talking to the militants. First of all, the army had conducted these deals even before the elections. Even before the elections, they were talking to Baitullah Masood, and these deals were in place. The deal itself with Baitullah Masood has never been published, but what we know is that the deal was in place. And basically, the civilian government, when it won the elections and came into power, it was presented with this fait accompli. That, here's the deal, you better support it, because, isn't this what you wanted, by the way? You wanted to talk to the civilians. Now, what the ANP and even what the People's Party and what Benazir expressed, before she was so tragically killed, was the fact that the civilian political parties want political reform in Fatah. And Benazir was the most eloquent and the most, staunchest backer of this, even before she returned to Pakistan, which was that Fatah has to be brought into the constitution of Pakistan. It has to become a part of Pakistan. With the consultations of Fatah, and there has to be a political reform process begun in Fatah, so that these are archaic British laws which govern Fatah at the moment and create this kind of no man's land concept should be ended and become Fatah. Now, you can't do that right away. Now, I believe very strongly that the government should announce a plan for changing the status of Fatah as soon as possible. They should express some vision. It can't be implemented because Fatah is thoroughly Talibanized at the moment. Those Pashtun tribesmen who are opposed to the Taliban were never protected by the army. They were driven out by the Taliban or they were executed. Many of the tribal leaders were executed. There are some 200,000 people in Fatah who are now living in Karachi and Islamabad and other parts of Pakistan. They were driven out, over the last 2 or 3 years. Now, what needs to be done is you need a very long process in which the government announces a program of political reform, bringing Fatah into Pakistan, and then announces a step of intermediary measures, such as, for example, bringing these refugees back to their homes and putting them back into place, and but most importantly, protecting them against the Taliban. Now, the question is the army prepared to do that? Is the army prepared to play a role as helping bringing Fatah into the political process, helping the civilian government extend a program of aid and reform and, job creation and all the rest of it? Now, I mean, encouraging today, Britain today has just announced a doubling of aid to Pakistan, which includes a lot of money for Fatah. Now, the Americans have also done the same. The G8 are also going to do the same. My first recommendation was that the Americans wanted to give the money to the army, because the army said to the Americans, well, there's nobody in Fatah who can do anything. The NGOs can't go there. The civilian government can't function. So give us the money. We'll do the development. So, I mean, this would have been an absolute catastrophe, because, I mean, the last people you want to do development in Fatah is the military. How is the civilian government going to extend political reform and all the rest of it if the reform is going to be carried out by the military? So I hope this British money is not going to go, to the military to carry out development. I hope it's going to wait, even if that money has to wait for a time, until the situation improves in Fatah and until the civilian government and the military speak from the same page and do something collectively about improving the situation in Fatah. I hope that money should wait until something like that happens.
So the policies of the Pakistan military seem to be crucial, but everyone seems to have a hard time understanding what the leadership wants. General Kayani, who when he came in, the Americans applauded it. They say he's going to be a friend of the West. He's a straight-talking soldier. He's not an Islamist. And yet, from what we've seen so far, is that he's been very unwilling to cooperate with the tripartite forums they've set up to discuss the problems along the border. Where does he want to take both the military and, of course, in Pakistan by definition?
I really wouldn't want to speculate on that because honestly I have no idea. He's a man of very few words and he said hardly anything. I mean, there are certain facts which we know that, number one, the army, I think, is very demoralized because of the fighting that has taken place in FATA and the losses it has taken. I think just as in Pakistani society, which is so deeply polarized, I think that polarization is not absent from the army, it's very present in the army. The polarization between, very strong anti-Americanism, anti-Westernism, this idea that this is America's war, this is not our war. These fundamentalists are all the creation of bad American policies in Afghanistan, etc. Which at one level may all be true. But so I think, what we've seen so far is that the army chief does not want to engage the army, the regular army, in any conflict with the extremists inside Pakistan. Now, that doesn't bode well for the civilian government. How is the civilian government, no matter, even if it gets its act together in the next few months, how does the civilian government implement law and order? Because it needs security forces and military forces. If the army is not going to be deployed, then what instrument does the civilian government have to try and improve the law and order situation in FATA and other places? So really, I mean, it is a very, very big. Not only I think is there this division between the civilian government and the army, but also clearly there are divisions within the civilian government and there are divisions within the army. So it's a very complex problem. And as I said earlier, this is not, it is becoming, Afghanistan is becoming a regional crisis that has to be tackled that's why I wrote this book. I mean, this book, you couldn't write this book about Pakistan. You couldn't write this book about Afghanistan. You had to write the book about the whole region. And you had to write the book about the interaction of the region with the West. And I mean, it was very difficult to do, but I mean, I couldn't see, myself writing a book which was just, uni-focused on one issue. It would be much easier, of course, for me to write a comprehensive book on Afghanistan and what happened. But you couldn't write about Afghanistan without the rest of it.
Before I open it up to questions, just bring it back to Afghanistan for a moment, because of course when Pakistani leaders are accused of worsening the situation in Afghanistan, they say, listen, don't look at us, look at the Afghan leadership, look at their policies, look at their failure to meet the needs of the people. Now, at the Paris conference recently, where Afghanistan got some $20 billion pledged by the international community, there was a lot of concern about the corruption. Something had to be done about it. How do you see that developing?
Well, again, I think on the aid side, there is no effective leadership on either side. There's no effective leadership from the West, which should be which should be monitoring and implementing much greater vigilance on the side of the Afghans. And should be also dealing with this, the issue of corruption and waste within the donor community that I talked about earlier. And at the same time, there has to be a much more proactive Afghan government, which is, dealing with this money in a much more fair basis. Unfortunately, both are failing at the moment. There's no leadership in Kabul and there's no leadership in Washington, which is wanting to or is capable of dealing with the weaknesses on both sides.
Let me just read you the paragraph on page 402 when you're coming to the end of Ahmed's book, and I hope you'll all take a chance to read it. He says, Bush promised a great transformation in 2001, and he certainly transformed the world, but not in the way that any of us could ever have imagined. We now all have to live with the consequences, pick up the pieces, and help improve the world we are left with by tilting the Earth's axis back to where it should be. How formidable is that? Is all lost now because of all of the mistakes you've talked about and more?
No, all is, it is formidable, but I don't think all is lost, because I think that the two main actors in this, the people of Afghanistan and the people of Pakistan, they want change, they want development, they want democracy, they want to be ruled justly and fairly. They are not essentially extremists. And I think that remains the main building block with which the West should approach this region. Thank you.
Let's open it up to questions, because I know you come from different walks of life. You'll have different aspects that you're interested in. So I want to give you all a chance to ask some of your questions, and also maybe we'll have some people online. And when you stand up, please identify yourself, unless you want to remain anonymous. Isn't really allowed. Okay. Nobody speechless? Oh, okay. Right here. This gentleman.
Well, Aminullah Habibi, research fellow at the Defense Academy, but originally from Afghanistan. And I'm quite happy to hear, I think your views are quite known in Afghanistan, and we don't hear that view much in Pakistan. And Afghans expect more of this kind of views. What I wanted to ask you, lots of questions, but I cannot.
Let's start with one. Let's start with one.
Just one, and that is that the perception in Afghanistan is that Afghanistan will never be peaceful unless Pakistan is put under pressure to stop supporting, organizing, and training the militants there. And the perception is there that Baytullah Masood, Mullah Omar, all of them are under the attention of ISI, trained by them, and sent to Afghanistan. Given the fact that Pakistan, half of the time that Pakistan became an independent country, the military ruled Pakistan. And the military at the other time still was in power in a different way. Supporting Taliban or Talibanization of the Pakistan, would that be a kind of threat for the whole existence of Pakistan and, of course, continuation of the problem in Afghanistan? Thank you.
Is that what they teach you at the Defense Academy in Britain?
Well, I mean, look, I don't think you can deal with this issue by just putting pressure on Pakistan. What is needed is a mixture of pressure and incentives. The army has to be, the military to give up this strategy. You have to also convince the military. I think you have to give a package of, yes, pressure, but yes, also incentives. I mean, one of the incentives I talked about was dealing with India. And showing the Indians that they have to be part of this, and they themselves will be threatened by Talibanization, if you like. Secondly, don't forget that this is a nuclear power. You're dealing with a military which controls nuclear weapons. This is not a run-of-the-mill military. So it has to be handled with great sensitivity. But I think the issue has to be dealt with. Secondly, I think a very important part of this is strengthening the civilian government. We have not seen in the last 4 months the international community really put its money behind the civilian government. And that, I think, has really been tragic. I mean, for whatever reasons, it really needs to do that. So I think ultimately the Talibanization that is taking place in Pakistan is confined to one province at the moment and one ethnic group. The whole country is not being Talibanized, and it's a very similar situation to what is happening in Afghanistan. The whole of Afghanistan is not being Talibanized. But what I think, the Pashtuns with the government in Kabul and the Pashtuns in Pakistan, what they're showing, the ANP, what they're showing is that there's an alternative Pashtun worldview apart from the Taliban. Some people would like to say, well, all the Pashtuns are Taliban, and all the Taliban are Pashtuns. But I think what we have now is the first chance of both in Pakistan and Afghanistan. We've got Pashtuns, whether it's Hamid Karzai or whether it's people in the ANP. We have Pashtuns who are giving an alternative point of view to the Taliban, and I think that must be encouraged.
Thank you.
Hello.
Wait for the microphone.
My name is Rayhan Dimitri. I'm from the BBC, and I have a question about Central Asia. You've mentioned Central Asian Talibans. Where are they? Do we know about them? Is it dangerous for how dangerous is it for Central Asian republics? I mean, we know about proximity, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, or neighboring Afghanistan, but where are they?
Well, you have several Central Asian groups who are working with the Taliban. The Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan, the Islamic Jihad Union. You have several, but particularly groups led by Uzbeks who have been working with the Taliban, who are based in FATA, who have been working with Al-Qaeda. They've been helping promote the drugs trafficking for Al-Qaeda and the Taliban through Central Asia to Russia, which was one of the main exit routes. And there's certainly, what we are seeing is that the numbers of Central Asians and Chechens and people from that region has increased quite dramatically in the last 2 or 3 years. A lot of them came over after 9/11, when the Taliban were routed. Many were killed, but a lot of them came over, and they were in their hundreds, I think, at that time. I think now those who are living, the Central Asians who are working with Al-Qaeda and Taliban, are now in their thousands. And they're able, in their few thousands, not many thousands, but few thousands. And the fact is that there is no doubt that there are people coming and going now. There's no doubt that there is the Central Asian groups who are working with Al-Qaeda in FATA are being able to set down a underground network also in Central Asia. I mean, they're not just fighting for the Taliban or fighting for Al-Qaeda or fighting against the Kabul regime. They're obviously also fighting or attempting to lay down a network for their own cause back home. And the fact that in a country like Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, you really have no democratic opposition. The big fear is that these people, and certainly there will be a crisis in Uzbekistan when Karimov dies, and very possibly in Tajikistan, there could be huge economic crisis in both these countries because of the levels of poverty and the economic crisis there. When these regimes crack, the real danger is that the people who could be in a position to take advantage of that would be the extremists, because they are the only organized element, as there's no other democratic forces there.
That gentleman here with the blue. Just wait for the microphone, please.
Sorry, my name is Farjas Walker. Can you say something about how you see the relationship between the Taliban and the ideas of what are described by Bush and everybody else as international jihadism?
You mean between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda? I mean, yeah. Well, I mean, the practical relationship, I think, has been simply that Al-Qaeda has helped the Taliban enormously in reconstructing themselves, after 9/11. I mean, if you see this insurgency now, I mean, the Taliban are much, much more sophisticated than the Taliban, I wrote about in the 1990s. They have, for example, their media cell, their tactics now being used, the use of suicide bombings, the use of these new explosives. Much of this has come because of the collaboration with Al-Qaeda. And the fact that Al-Qaeda has also opened a route for them to travel back and forth to Iraq. A lot of these tactics and material support has come from Iraq. Iraqi commanders have come to Afghanistan and Pakistan, and Taliban have gone to Iraq. So, at every level, if you look at the income, I mean, one thing which is quite remarkable is that the Pakistani Taliban and the Afghan Taliban are flush with money. A lot of it is coming from the drugs trade. Now, the Taliban basically taxed farmers. Now, in Afghanistan, who grew poppy. Now, you don't raise this kind of money that we're seeing today from taxing farmers, because there's a limit to what the farmers can give you. So what is happening now, for example, is that the traffickers along the route, not just in Afghanistan, but as you know, drugs increases, enormously. The price of drugs increases enormously as you get out to Europe and America and all the rest of it. So a lot of the trafficking, I think Al-Qaeda has now takes a big percentage from the traffickers. All over the world, possibly. I mean, and so the income has just increased enormously. So Al-Qaeda, I mean, the relationship has increased, but the Taliban as a movement are still doing. The leadership certainly is very much linked to this whole international jihad, global jihad business. and you know, want the foreign forces out of Afghanistan, etc., etc. But there's also a strong kind of Pashtun. They're also trying to present themselves as Pashtun Islamists, as a kind of national Afghan national liberation force, but with obviously a heavy Islamist bias. But frankly, I think what is undermining that position, which would be a more logical position for the Taliban to adopt, actually, what is undermining that position is the brutality with which they are conducting the war. The executions, the suicide bombings, the killing of civilians, etc., etc. And this is something that they didn't do in this kind of manner before 9/11, you know, until this reorganization took place by Al-Qaeda. So they have become far more brutal towards their fellow Afghans than they ever, you know, adopting the tactics of Al-Qaeda and other groups. And that has really been, I think, very damaging for them.
So that it's less likely that Pashtun nationalism will morph into an Afghan nationalism?
No, I mean, that's why I said earlier it is so important that Pashtun nationalism does not morph into Taliban. And that's why the ANP in Pakistan is so important, because the ANP is giving you a different view of Pashtun nationalism, a completely different concept of that we can be Pashtun, we can be tribal, we can be traditional, but we can also be modern, we can be pro-development, we can be anti-extremist, etc. So I think it's terribly important that this alternative view, you know, is pushed forward, and it needs to be pushed forward by the People's Party, you know, by as I say, expressing a desire to change the political status of Fatah.
The lady in the back, with just behind, the blonde hair, yep, glasses.
Hello, my name is Justine Hardy. I'm based most of the time in Indian-controlled Kashmir. And I just really want to ask something, clarification of this gentleman's question. You talk quite generically as if Al-Qaeda and the Taliban are working hand in hand now, even though I think we all know, well, I think most people here will realize that the intelligence, the international intelligence, have very often worked on the basis that they have very separate ideologies. Are you meaning to say now, because I may have misunderstood you, but you make it sound as if they are in total cooperation with each other now?
Well, you know, no, I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that Al-Qaeda is helping. You know, Al-Qaeda now is probably, the core of Al-Qaeda now probably is a few hundred people in the northwest region of Pakistan. It's probably not more than that. Al-Qaeda is not a hands-on organization which is directing, you know, day-to-day operations of the Taliban. They are facilitating the Taliban. They are helping the Taliban, you know, reorganize themselves in ways that I said, you know, media, tactics, explosives, drugs, money, things like that. So they're cooperating very closely. In turn, the Taliban give them protection. The Pakistani Taliban give them protection, the Afghan Taliban give them protection. Now, for example, the Europeans who have been training recently, the German Turks, the British Muslims, others who've been up there to Fatah to train. Now, how do you think it works? The Al-Qaeda provides the trainer. You know, the Taliban provide the protection for that camp, whether it's Afghan Taliban or Pakistani Taliban. So, you know, I mean, there is a cooperation between the two. Yes, Al-Qaeda has an ideology which is global. But certainly Al-Qaeda also has an ideology which is that we want to help the Taliban take as much territory as possible in the northwest frontier and in Afghanistan so that we can re-establish the kind of safe havens that we had before 9/11. You know, Al-Qaeda is not a. I believe, you know, I'm a very old-fashioned guy. But if you look back to the national liberation movements of the '60s, you know, when you had all the, you know, left-wing movements in the Third World and all the rest of it, you know, and you talked about liberated areas and bases and territory. I think this is terribly important to Al-Qaeda. You know, they are not operating just in the cyberspace and, you know, the internet. No, they need territory to live, to be protected, to train, to expand, to bring in people from outside, you know. And the Taliban, Al-Qaeda does not have the manpower to do that. The Taliban are helping them do that, you know. You know, it's a very complex relationship, I think. But it's to do with the nuts and bolts of an ideological movement that is kind of pie in the sky, but it's also nuts and bolts of, you know, on the ground. How much ground do we control? How much population do we control? You know, where are our routes? Where are our safe houses, etc. So I think it's a very close cooperative relationship.
Maybe this is a good point for you to also maybe to tell us a bit more about the Taliban, because there's now the Pakistani Taliban, there's the Afghan Taliban, and people talk about the ideological Taliban. They talk about the marriage of convenience, those who join up simply for a job, because it comes then to the question everyone is asking now, and people, some are trying to act on, is that should you talk to the Taliban? And if so, who do you talk to? So maybe you could give us a little bit more nuance in terms of the Taliban as well.
Well, you know, I mean, I think at the moment, unfortunately what has happened, the growth of the Pakistani Taliban has been, you know, the Pakistani Taliban have essentially developed under the wing of Al-Qaeda. They were protecting Al-Qaeda after 9/11. So in a sense, they are even more fiercely ideological as a group than the Afghan Taliban are. I think there are many divisions within the Afghan Taliban. You know, some believe in this global jihad, some don't. You know, a lot of the, Afghanistan remains a very fractured society, and the Taliban remain a very fractured group. Now, they are, you know, they believe in their central leadership, and they follow that because a lot of their supplies and their ammunition and their food and their money comes from that central leadership. But I think the Pakistani Taliban are, they also are separated, they have separate militias, etc. But because they grew up under the shadow of Al-Qaeda after 9/11, they gave protection, they provided the safe houses, they provided the food, you know, everything to Al-Qaeda in Fatah and in the northwest of the country. They are, you know, more ideological and becoming even more brutal. Now, it is nowhere in Pashtun tradition. I mean, the other day the Pakistani Taliban executed 22 people, you know, in cold blood. Now, I mean, this is not something, you know, that is in Pashtun, you know, nowhere in Pashtun Valley or Pashtun law or Pashtun tradition is this thing acceptable. So I think, you know, what we are seeing is a Pakistani Taliban that's more ideological, more brutal, more under the thumb of Al-Qaeda, if you like. And now they have their own agenda, which is that they want to expand their writ in the northwest. They want to create a Sharia state, what they call a Sharia state, a state ruled by Islamic law in the northwest part of Pakistan. And bring their means to bring the population under their control. Just compare that to how the Taliban in Afghanistan operated in the early 90s. The Taliban in the early 90s essentially tried to woo the population by getting rid of the warlords, by getting rid of the drug traffickers, by disarming the warlord militias. The Pakistani Taliban today are trying to terrorize the population into supporting them. That's how they won in Fatah. That's how they conquered Fatah, literally. By killing or displacing anybody who opposed them. You know.
And briefly, how do you see the Afghan Taliban? Because people talk about the Quetta Taliban, they talk about Helmand Taliban, they talk about those who might are fed up with fighting, may want to talk, others who are more ideological. Just a brief.
I think, you know, all these groups exist in the Taliban. The Taliban leadership is based in Quetta. It's based around Quetta now. I don't think they're in Quetta anymore, but they're based in Balochistan province. And they basically run the movement in the south. In where the British are, the Canadians, you know, etc. In the east, what you have, those running the movement are basically allies of the Taliban, principally Jalaluddin Haqqani and Gulbuddin Hikmatyar. These are the two main Afghan groups which are fighting in eastern Afghanistan, and they're very closely allied. Now, what is the relationship between Mullah Omar and, say, Jalaluddin Haqqani and, say, Bin Laden and, say, Baitullah Masood? I mean, you know, I think it's a very. I mean, I don't know. If I knew, you know, I'd be, you know, a rich man. But I don't know.
You could be a dead man too.
But I could be a dead man too. But all I do know is that, I mean, it's a very close cooperative relationship. And you see, I mean, someone like myself who just, you know, you see how they are constantly on the military front, on the political front, on the media front. They're constantly, you know, working together in complete, you know, cooperation, as it were. Helping each other, you know.
And you realize that the real cost of not moving against these people sooner now, it's Jalaluddin Haqqani's son, Sirajuddin Haqqani, who seems actually more brutal than the father. So the next generation is already consolidating. More questions? Just anything?
Gosh.
Saira Vahidi, ex-journalist from Pakistan. Just wanted to take up something Lyse asked you about the civilian government, about the newly elected civilian government. I think you glossed over too easily their approach to fighting terrorism in Pakistan. Because I was there watching television, on every television program, every leader from every party in Pakistan, except perhaps the MQM, would say that their strategy in dealing with terrorism in Pakistan is to talk to people and to make deals with them. Yet you turned around and said there was a deal already with Baitullah Masood in Pakistan, with the military having a deal with Baitullah Masood. Given that the military then accused Baitullah Masood of Benazir's murder, would you say the military is complicit in Benazir's assassination?
Look, I have no idea, but I think Benazir was killed by extremists. Now, whether they came from Waziristan and FATA, or whether they came from inside the intelligence, or whether they were retired, she was certainly killed by extremists. I think the problem is that I think the civilian government has it has limited leadership. I mean, for example, just think of if Benazir had been alive. I mean, there would not. First of all, I don't think there would have been this huge differences in the coalition government. Nawaz Sharif's kind of, hankering and all his opposition would have been silenced. I think the army would have been much more, if you like, obedient, or much more willing to listen to the civilian government. I think the international community would have treated the civilian government much differently than what it is treating it now if Benazir had been there. So what I'm trying to say is that there is a leadership vacuum. There's no question. I mean, nobody can fill her shoes. The international community itself is confused as to who to talk to. Do we talk to the Prime Minister, or do we talk to Asif Zardari, or who do we talk to? I mean, who's the real power? So, but I think the main issue is that the coalition has got itself so bogged down in its inter-feuding over the judges issue, the constitutional issue, etc., that it really, it's not even addressing the economic issue. The economic crisis in Pakistan is very, very grave right now. It's not just related to the oil price rise and the food price rise internationally. It's related to the fact that there's a flight of capital, there is a complete stoppage in all investment, we're running down our foreign exchange reserves and having to buy fuel, there's an electricity crisis which has paralyzed industry and the economy as a whole. And you look at the civilian government, and frankly, they have not really addressed the issues at all. You need some kind of plank, for the really poor, so that the really poor don't suffer. So if they haven't addressed the economic issue, I think the two biggest issues which the coalition should be addressing are extremism and the economy. And really, they have not addressed either of these issues. And yes, it's sad, it's tragic, it's bad. It's giving the army the excuse to come back in perhaps a few months or a few years and say, we told you these civilians can't do anything, they're inefficient, they're incompetent, so we better come back and rule you now. Tragically, I hope that doesn't happen. I hope that kind of tragedy doesn't happen. And I hope the army shows some patience with the civilians. But it's going to be a huge effort. But I think part of that is that the international community certainly needs to support the civilian government.
Here.
Hi, Andy Corcoran. I think my question is related to some of what you've already said, actually. But you mentioned at one point that there was a need for reliable mechanisms or instruments to deliver law and order, to support law and order in FATA and elsewhere. Obviously, the civilians can't get in there to deliver it. The military is probably the wrong vehicle to deliver it. I was wondering, to what extent do you think there's a role for the traditional Pashtun tribal leadership, the Maliks, the Mullahs, etc., or is it the case that their potency is too diluted by insurgent influence, too contaminated by the narcotics trade? Is there a role for them? Sure.
Absolutely, there's a role for them. But as I said earlier, in FATA, they have been driven out. They've been executed. I mean, we've killed over. I mean, the Taliban have killed over 200 tribal elders. Those, in other words, who are these people? These were people who were opposing the Taliban. They were, they were supporting the government or whatever it was, but they were killed because they opposed the Taliban. So, yes, I mean, that is a very important mechanism in Pashtun society, which is respected by all, sides, except the Taliban. The Taliban, in Afghanistan too, they tried to completely destroy the Malik system, the tribal chief system, and elevate the mullah to become the main peg in which the clan and the tribe should revolve around. Now, that's a total falsification of traditional Pashtun society, because the mullah is not the number one. He's not numero uno. The tribal malik is and the nature of the tribal malik may change. He may be a traditional guy today. He may be an owner of many trucks or a businessman or whatever. But so I think yes, it's a very important part. But I mean, you have to give these people, you have to get these people back into FATA. You have to protect them. You have to give them some support, some political support. That's not happening at the moment.
Martin?
Thank you. Can I go back a bit to a question which has come up again and again, which is the mystery of the mind of the Pakistani officer corps? Normally, the reaction of a regular army to armed forces on their patch, or to people denying them access into the territory they supposedly defend and control, is to jump on them from a very great height. And whatever the attractions for the Pakistani armed forces of the idea of deep defense against India, surely we're way past at the point where that should be the governing factor in their calculations. You're now in a situation where their sovereignty, as it were, as an armed force, is being threatened. I suppose another way of putting the question is: are they intellectually inert? Do they talk about these matters? Is there any way in which the armed forces discuss their role? They've been an incredibly unsuccessful security establishment. They've lost every war they've been involved in. They're very, very expensive. They're very, it seems, from some of the things you can say, they're very, very stupid. Do they reflect? Do they think? This is my question.
I should point out the Pakistani diplomats left just before that question. Ahmed.
You should read Michael Father's review in the New Statesman today, which has just come out. Which is he's got some very good comments on this. Martin, I think the problem in Pakistan is simply that the army has, since our birth or since the 50s, the army has defined national security. Now, that has been tragic because the army's concept of national security is completely different from any civilian Pakistani's concept of national security. I mean, national security in the broader context means development, jobs, whatever, modernization, protection of the people. The army in Pakistan, unfortunately, has fought more wars against its own people than even against India. Whether it was East Pakistan or recently against the Baloch and etc. So I think we have a major problem here. We have a major structural problem here. And after all, I mean, all these questions about the civilian government and the army, what is this all about? This is a historic problem we've had. The army does not respect civilian law and civilian rule. And it gives the civilians a certain time to kind of badmouth themselves or to fail, and the civilians will fail if the army is undermining them constantly. So I think what we need is a long period of civilian rule. We need the civilians to gradually encroach upon the army's control of foreign policy, especially towards India and Afghanistan. And we need the civilians to slowly persuade the army that a different concept of national security is needs to be accepted by the army and the civilian. And there should be a joint concept of national security, not this obsession with India and the obsession with undermining your neighbors, and the only way you can keep afloat is to have these extremists who do your foreign policy for you on both your borders. I mean, I think Pakistanis essentially are fed up with this. And Pakistanis have to be given a chance. The problem has been also, again, that the Americans have essentially backed this concept because it served their ends in the Cold War. We were the front line against the Soviets, then we were the front line against the Soviets in Afghanistan, and then we were embraced as the front line against Al-Qaeda. So, I mean, my other question is, when is the international community going to wake up about this? And we need help. I mean, I don't think this task of creating a new civil concept of national security can take place without international help.
There's a woman in this, yeah. Martin, do you want to pass where's the microphone?
Tamara Chalabi, it's a follow-up of this last question. You mentioned during your talk that the army needs to be incentivized to do something about the Taliban beyond their existential relationship to India and the Indian threat. And
sorry, I don't know where you're speaking from. Can you? Okay. Thanks.
And I just wanted to ask. I mean, on the one hand, you say that the international community needs to provide this incentivization, and on the other hand. I mean, as far as I know, Pakistan is one of the largest recipients of US aid, I think, barring Israel, which I presume the military is privy to, part of that. So would you mind clarifying exactly what type of incentivization beyond redefining national security on a short-term level?
Well, I think the Americans have given $11.8 billion since 9/11. 80% of that has gone directly to the military. Now, what message are the Americans sending to the people of Pakistan? Frankly. The Americans have talked about, a democracy dividend after this government came into power. In $1 billion worth of aid to the civilian government in order to help it deal with the economic crisis. It hasn't happened so far. If you look at the military aid, where has that military aid gone? Has the military used that aid to fight extremism on the Afghan border? No. The military has instead, with that money, bought submarines, much needed in Afghanistan, obviously. Warships, F-16s, to fight who? Essentially to fight India. So the Americans have given, $8 or $9 billion to help the army rearm itself vis-a-vis India. Great. Now, what do you do? Where is the aid to fight extremism? Did the Americans put conditionalities on that aid? That this aid should not be used to buy submarines? Because Afghanistan doesn't have a sea around it, So unfortunately, the problem again is very heavily, the international community has to be faulted for this kind of, yes, the army is wasting this money or spending this money wrongly. So the forces on the Afghan border who should be fighting extremists, some of them don't have shoes. The Frontier Corps is so poorly equipped. And essentially what is happening now is that the army has gone to the Americans and said, now you should arm the Frontier Corps. Well, the army, the Americans should reply, well, what happened to all the money we gave you for the last 8 years? Shouldn't you have armed the Frontier Corps to face down this threat on the Afghan border and deal with Taliban? Now you've armed your regular army against India. Now you want us to arm the Frontier Corps finally. So I think there's been one blunder after another.
Now we're coming to the end, and on the list of people who want to speak, I have the gentleman here. I've got 2 questions here. This is always the way. As soon as you close the list, everyone wants to have. So we're going to let's take these 2. We'll have people making their, and then Ahmed will take the last. Yeah. Yes, They're sitting together, but they have different questions.
Let them ask them
Gabrielle Rifkin.
together.
That's what you have something.
From Oxford Research Group. Endless conflict really hardens attitudes, and the military approach to the Taliban seems to have created more extreme behaviour on their part.
Yeah.
What would have happened at the time of the Bonn Agreement if they had been brought into the process?
I was wondering about whether it's really worth to elaborate a bit on the pre-2001 period, especially with the Cold War that you spoke about, when Al-Qaeda basically were established by forces, and they were pretty popular, and they were basically formed to face the Soviet Union. And the drastic change from this corner to the other corner, they were allies, now they were enemies. Is it worth looking briefly into this arena?
If it's possible. Let's bring the microphone just to this side, just so.
Who, the Soviets?
Even before the pre-2001 and during the Cold War and the development of these groups.
Okay, I haven't understood the question.
Do your question, please?
Yeah.
Hi. Now, hopefully it's not too complicated with the two that you already had. Mr. Rashid, Gravehouse, nice to meet you. My question is a political question, actually. I'm mindful of your book, Chaos. I haven't read it yet, look forward to that. My immediate association with chaos would be First Correct Western Trains or the banking industry. Egg, especially, if anyone's from there. But I assume, obviously, chaos is associated with a very complex issue, and from what you've debated tonight, the issue is extremely complex. You mentioned, and you've touched on it again in questions, that there's a lack of long-term strategy from the West, US and the UK, one could suggest. Is that not a reflection of our own democratic process? A mere 5 years of our democratic cycle and an electorate that expects fix today, one would suggest that the chaos is an enduring issue as a result of our own democratic process. Is there a relationship there that you'd comment on?
You can think about that, just pass it slide with diagonal.
What an existential
yes,
question.
I know.
I mean,
you can tell the witching hour is coming. Do you want to just quickly?
We're talking the bar.
Yes. Excuse me, could you just pass to the first row? Very quickly.
Jemima Montague, working in Cultural Heritage Organisation in Kabul. I'm just interested in, you're talking about a regional political solution, and I'm interested in the role of Iran and whether you might comment on increased sanctions and any possible nuclear action that's being much discussed at the moment, and the effect that this might have on the situation in Afghanistan at the moment.
Well, yours is too existential. I mean, I have to have a drink before I answer that. And I'm sorry, but yours I just couldn't understand. But let me answer yours.
The roots of it. The roots of it pre-2000. The whole period before 2000 would led to the rise of these militant groups.
As far as Pakistan is concerned, or Afghanistan?
Just the militancy. Yeah, the militancy.
Okay. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Well, I mean, the roots of Al-Qaeda go back to the Mujahideen, and the fact that, America first, or the West first abandoned Afghanistan after the Soviet withdrawal in 1989 and left all these thousands of people on a loose limb. No cleaning up was done in the sense. Afghanistan was not developed, etc. So I think the roots very much go back to that, and again, U.S. policy, has to be criticized for that, for not wanting to deal with Afghanistan at that time. Of course, that led to the civil war and the rise of the Taliban, and the rest is history. I think your question is very interesting. I mean, Lakhdar Brahimi has said that the Taliban should have been there. I had a long conversation with Kofi Annan recently, and Kofi said to me, I mean, there was no way we could have brought the Taliban in. And if they had been there, they would have created more problems than solutions, and I would have been against it. So, I mean, it's very interesting. You have, completely opposite views, Kofi Annan and Brahimi, having different views. My own view is that, frankly, the Taliban, you would not have been able to get hold of the Taliban. You would not have, and the Taliban would not have come. What you should have had at Bonn was much better Pashtun representation, which was missing. Now, much better Pashtun representation, what does that mean? It means basically you could have got some real hardline Pashtuns who were very close to the Taliban coming in. You could have put pressure on Pakistan even at that time. There were Pashtuns, people like Haqqani, for example, Haqqani he's been allied to the Pakistani intelligence services for many, many years. You could have brought somebody like Haqqani into Bonn. Now, so I mean, I think that could have happened. I don't think Mullah Omar would have turned up at Bonn, for example. You know, I mean, no. And so I think Kofi is right on what he says there, rather than, you know, I think what Brahimi wishes is a wish rather than what could have happened. I think Iran has been Iran is a terribly important part of the equation. There is no doubt that I think Iran is arming some Taliban groups now, even though they're bitterly opposed to the Taliban, and there's extreme problems with Pakistan because they accuse the Pakistanis of, you know, sanctuary and all for the Taliban. But Iran is essentially acting in what it sees as its self-defense. It fears an American attack, and since last year. And consequently, it has armed anybody who's willing to kill Americans. It has armed everyone from Lebanon all the way to Pakistan. And if, God forbid, we see an attack on Iran, I think you will see uprisings, killings, terrorism, all the way across the Middle East, all the way to Pakistan. Which will be Iranian, you know, inspired and motivated, and not necessarily carried out by Iran. Because essentially, Iran will not retaliate against America or Israel directly. They will retaliate indirectly, you know, through this kind of guerrilla action. And secondly, I think the most fragile country, I think the country that could really fall apart if the Americans attack Iran is Afghanistan. Afghanistan is, I mean, it may have a very small Shia population, etc., but I think the anger in Afghanistan, which is first, of course, at the failure of the Americans in Afghanistan itself, and then the idea that the Americans are now bombing, you know, Iran or whatever it is. The fact that, you know, Karzai, for whatever his faults, has tried very hard to keep this balance between the Americans and not endanger his own regime at the hands of the Iranians. You know, that all that balance would just disappear. You know, and for example, if it was found that, you know, the Americans used Afghan airspace to bomb Iran, you know, that would be absolutely catastrophic for the Afghan government. So there again, it's not a question just of bombing Iran and taking out a few missiles or taking out a few of its nuclear things. It's the consequences in the region, which would obviously, I mean, everything I've talked about would be made about 50 times worse if that happened. Thank you.
Well, we could go on for a long time because it's clear now that a lot of the questions we're focusing on now are questions that actually are coming up every day. Even just before we all gathered tonight, President Bush is talking about sending more troops to Afghanistan before the end of this year, the beginning of the next. Admiral Michael Mullen, who's the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, is warning Pakistan if they have credible intelligence, they'll go in to Pakistan or the tribal agencies to go after them. And so we're very grateful to you, Ahmed, for coming in and sharing some of your reflections and some of your scholarship, your research over the past several years, in fact, for many decades. Now, I don't work for Penguin Books, so I can't urge you to buy Ahmed's book, although I see that Ahmed is wearing his orange penguin tie tonight. But I think I will say, because we are at the Frontline Club, and it is, as you know, a club in which not only do we gather for these sorts of events, but it's also to encourage journalists on the spot. And Ahmed, when he wrote became a best-selling book, The Taliban, gave what was a very high percentage of his royalties to development projects in Afghanistan to contribute to the development of Afghan journalists. And he funded journalists and magazines and media right across Afghanistan. So I think we have to thank you for that as well, Ahmed, for what you have done in terms of promoting media and a free press inside Afghanistan. And I think we have to thank Martin Woolacott for giving you a chance way back in 1978, taking a chance on this mad Pakistani journalist. And we are still gathering to hear what you have to say. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.